Hi, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so we're ready to start Sif Bays. It's a lot of material in Sif Aleph. So why don't we start Sif Bays, which tells us as follows. V'chol zeh b'vehema u'metaltalin. Everything that we've discussed until now is dealing with chattel, with animals and other movable objects, as far as my obligation to watch it and my prohibition of lending it out to others unless I have express permission from the owner. Okay. But if a person rents a house from his friend, if a person rents a house from his friend, Rashai lahaskiro la'acher, he is permitted to sublet. He can rent out the house to another party. Let's continue reading. This is the aggravating part. Shalo yihiyu b'nei beso merubim mibnei beso. Sorry. Uvilvad shalo yihiyu b'nei beso merubim mibnei beso shel hasocher. But that's with one proviso, that you have to make sure that the population, the amount of people living in the house, does not exceed the family members of the landlord. In other words, if a guy owns a house and he says, I'm making aliyah, I'm going to Israel for the year, let's say. So he wants to rent out his house. So he can rent out his house to Ruvain, and Ruvain can rent out the house to Shimon. But with the proviso that Ruvain does not have the right to to Shimon, the subtenant, cannot have more occupancy than the renter himself, than the person who's renting the house. Because when the Balabayas rented it to Ruvain, it was under the understanding that he was going to have a certain number of people as tenants. So that tenancy cannot be exceeded by the sublessee. Okay? Okay. V'chein hashoel, and the same thing is true with the borrower. Rashai lahashil, va'afilu lahaskir lisman meshech yemei she'ilaso. And when it comes to real estate, the same thing is true with borrowing. If, let's say, a friend of mine lends me his summer cottage to use, I have a right now to take that summer cottage and turn around and let someone else borrow it. I can even rent it out if I want to and make money off of my friend's summer cottage that he lent me. So he's not making any money, I'm making money. And the reason is, Lefi shahakarka b'cheskas urishus be'aleha omedes, v'i efshir lahavricha, v'lo shayich ba ne'emanus klal. He says, the reason is because real estate always remains in the constant possession of the owner, and it's impossible to remove that level of ownership from the owner. So what does that have to do with the rights that a lessee has? We'll see in the commentary. But v'lo shayich ba ne'emanus klal, and therefore there's no issue of trusting another party. It's as if the owner is there the entire time. And therefore, there's no such thing as, do I need to trust you or the third party? I trust you more with my object than I trust the third party with my object. No, that's only when I relinquish an object from my possession, such as an animal or an inanimate object. There I could say, I relinquished it, I got rid of it and gave it to you, but I only trust you to hold on to it and not the other guy. But when it's real estate, I trust, I have to trust everyone equally because it's as if I'm still holding on to it. It's not a question of trust. And so what does that mean exactly? And what if there are knickknacks? What if there is furniture in the house that I'm concerned about? So all of this has to be analyzed very carefully. But clearly the halacha makes a distinction between metaltalin on the one hand, which is chattel, and karka on the other hand, real estate. Okay, so let's take a look at the commentaries. I'm sure there's going to be a number of qualifications for this halacha.
Yeah, because I think we're all sitting here feeling very uncomfortable about this. So, and being patient. I am anyway. So.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your patience. Okay. All right. All right. So, let's take a look at the commentary. So first, the Imrei Yaakov says, Rashai lahaskiro, you are permitted to rent out, to lease out property that you have leased from the owner. You can sublet it. Dafka bayis reik she'ein bo rihitim umetaltalin. So proviso number one, clearly it must be a completely empty house that is totally unfurnished. Once you borrow a furnished house, the halacha completely changes, right? Why? For obvious reasons, because the owner can always say, I've got my couches, my other furniture, my tables, my chairs, those are all metaltalin. I trust you to take good care, but not somebody else, okay? Lahaskiro, to rent it out. Let's say you happen to know that the person you want to sublet it to has a pattern of destroying property. Let's say he's a member of the band, and they've trashed a number of hotel rooms before. Okay, so. And so Oshu Gever Alim O Baal Merivos, or he's a person who uses violence, he's a mobster, or he's an argumentative person who likes to litigate and get into fights. O Eno Misnahig Benikius V'chayotze Bazeh, or he's an unclean, he's not hygienic or sanitary in the way that he lives his life, right? So Rashai Haba'olim Limnoa Milahaskir Lo. So then the owner can put a stop to it, because he can put forth an argument saying that this is a reckless person, or this is an unclean person. I don't want that person in my house. I'm going to have to fumigate my house for bed bugs once this guy leaves. That's not what I bargained for. Okay? La'acher. Now, what happens if I sublet it for more than what I'm paying for rent? Can I do that? He says, as long as I'm doing it legally, which means that I'm not exceeding the tenancy that I would have used to occupy the house, so then the profit goes to me. So I'm a family of four, and I lease the house, I sublet the house to another family of four, perfectly within my rights. There's no difference qualitatively between my family and that family, at least not on paper, but I was able to negotiate a better deal. I am paying, for just to round numbers, I'm paying $1,000 a month for the rental, but I was able to get $1,500 a month from my sublessee, so I get to keep that profit. It's a pretty good business if a guy rents apartments and then rents them out to others, right? V'im lo haya. If, however, I did not have the right to rent it out, because let's say I'm exceeding the tenancy that I had agreed to, so then any excess, any surplus, first of all, the landlord can evict me, But in the interim, whatever rent I do collect, the surplus goes to the landlord. Okay, goes to the owner. Okay, and the proviso is shelo yehiyu b'nei veiso merubin. He says you have to make sure that the sublessee does not exceed the occupancy of the lessee. Kain hu das harambam v'hashulchan aruch simin shin tez zayin sif aleph. Amnam hataz sham kasav b'das harash b'dein chiluk bazeh v'yesh lahater b'chol gavnei ayin sham. It's interesting that this is a machlokes, even though the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch paskin this way, that the sublessee's occupancy cannot exceed the lessee, but the Taz disagrees. And he quotes the Rashba as saying that in all cases you're allowed to sublet, which is surprising because that gives even more rights to a tenant, which could potentially be extremely problematic, right? Well, of course you got more rent, right? Because you rented it out to 20 migrant workers who came from the Philippines and they all needed a place to live, right? But in the meantime, it's creating problems with my plumbing, and we've got bed bugs, and the walls are all scuffed, and all of the other things that will happen when you increase tenancy and create increased density in a living space. Okay, Rashai lahashil, you're allowed to, if you borrow someone's real estate, you're allowed to lend it or even rent it to somebody else. Ayin masha kosafti b'viurim sof divrei hamaschil rashai lahaskiro le'inyan batim zmanenu. He says, as we'll see, that halacha may change in the contemporary world. Ba'afilu lahaskir lizman meshech yemei she'elaso. And you can do this for I think I left out this line. You can lease it or rent it out for the entire period of your contract with the owner. You can do it for that entire period of time. Pirish v'chol haschar shayach lahasocher. And therefore, all profit will go to the lessee. Dehoel v'haba'olim hishilu lo es beisam. And the reason is because since the owner grants them rights of occupancy during that time, zacha bahem hashol lemeshech hazman shehu shalo. The shoel, the borrower or the renter, the lessee, has full rights to use that profit, to use that property for the entire period of time. The kaven delekach shashel havracha, rashai lahashilu la'acherim huadin lahaskira. And since he cannot be evicted, and he has a right to lend the property to others, he also has a right to make money off the property. Below amrinan bazeh ketzad hala oses charo beparaso shel chavera. And we do not say, when it comes to real estate, an argument that is put forth by the Gemara regarding chattel. How can we allow you to make a profit off of your friend's cow? There, the Gemara does object that it's not right for you to make a profit off of a cow that belongs to somebody else. But here, when it comes to real estate, you do have a right to make a profit off of someone else's property.
Somebody lend the property to him to look after it without payment, and then he's renting it out. He's going to get a profit from that.
Yeah.
So he's going to make exchange his responsibility on that, right? Or no, this thing that, because you have a limited responsibility. Somebody can tell you, okay, can you look after it, but without any payment? It's a different that we are.
Right. That's true. If you're asking me to watch the house for you, that's different from asking me to doing there. I'm doing you a favor. If you ask me to watch your house, but let's say you didn't ask me to watch your house. I asked you, if you do me a favor, can I live in your house? So that's different. I'm now a shoel. My level of responsibility is the highest level of responsibility. So that gives me a right to lease it to whomever I want. I can even make money off of it. Point is that the assumption is that real estate is not as damageable, is not subject to the same level of loss or damage as chattel is. And that's the argument of it's always, no matter where that real estate is, as long as it's an empty house, it's always under the ownership of the owner, and there's only so much damage that I can do to it. So that's the reason why we allow it. So it will be different if you had only asked me to watch your house. You're not granting me rights of tenancy. I can't just go ahead and go into the house and live in it. But I've accepted responsibility to make sure that I take in the mail and the dog is fed. That's totally different, Okay, so there's still a lot for us to unpack. Yeah.
A maid or somebody who's staying in the house the whole time, but they're not coming to that house for 6-8 months or whatever.
Right.
So in that case, is that maid allowed to do what she?
Well, according to this halacha, yes, but we have to wait and see and find out some of the fine tuning. We already know that he's going to comment in the biurim that in certain situations the halacha has changed based on different patterns of living. So we'll see. We're going to have to see. So just all we've done is we've really only touched the surface. Okay.
That's why I remain patient out here in Zoom land.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. So, today's Rosh Chodesh. Oh my gosh. Thank you. No, it's not.
No, just Shabbos. Just Shabbos.
Sorry.
It's April Fool's. April Fool's, Rabbi. It's the 1st of April, but it's not.
You tried to get us to cut class.
That was just an April Fool's joke.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, let's take a look at some of the biurim. So Lashon HaRama. So first of all, Hasocher Bayis Machaver Rashai LaHaskira. When you rent, you lease, you're allowed to sublease. Lashon HaRama Siman Shin Membeis Mihu Davar She'i Efshur LaHavriach V'Lichbor Bo Kegon Bayis Osfina Mutar LaHashil. So okay, he's going on a technical point that the Rama talks about, puts a boat and a property in the same category. And he says that it's clear that we're only talking about a house that is not furnished and does not have any chattel in it. He just reiterates that point at the end of this piece. What I really should do is we should take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan's language over here, because there's certainly something that's a little bit ambiguous over here. But all right, we'll be able to do that later. Okay. Rashai lahaskiro, you're permitted to rent it out. Kasav harambam perakei mehilchos chiras halacha hey. Diyesh mi shahoda she'eno yachol lahaskiro la'acher klal. V'lo yera eli shezedin emes ad kan lashona. So the Rambam in the laws of leasing writes that there is someone who paskins that you're not allowed to sublet real estate. And the Rambam says, I do not think that is a correct halacha. V'harayvid sham kasav al zeh, diyesh b'doreinu omrim kain, Sheyesh b'nei adam shemachrivim bayis b'dirasam ad kan lashona. So the Ravid's commentary on that statement by the Rambam is that the reason why people feel that you're not allowed to sublease is because in our generation, he writes, they're writing in the 12th century, in our generation, there are people who, through their tenancy, can destroy a house. So what does that mean? Does that mean that construction standards have changed over the course of centuries? What does that really mean? Uveperik chaf gimel mehilchos mechira halacha ches kasav harambam the hasocher sadeh mechayvero eno rashai lahaskiro laacherim. So here's another interesting curiosity, is that in the laws of sales, in a different section of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam writes that when you rent a field from your friend, you're not allowed to lease the field to somebody else. The HaKesef Mishnah Sham Tama Allah B'Zelashona. So the commentary Kesef Mishnah, which was written by Rav Yosef Karo, questions the Rambam. He says, aren't you contradicting yourself? He says, Tema, Shaharei B'Perek, Chamishi Mehilchos Chirus, Kasav Shalo Amru, Ein Asocher Rishai Lahasker Ela B'Metalta, L'Valo B'Karka. He says, you wrote in that other section that the prohibition of lending or leasing to somebody else only applies to chattel, but not to real estate. So why would you change your position when it comes to a field? He says, don't argue that there's a distinction between a house and a field. Because if anything, there's more of an argument to prohibit leasing a house, subleasing a house, than subleasing a field. Because when you sublease a house, there's more possibility of destroying the actual structure. But with a field, it's just soil. How can you destroy soil? So that's the Kesef Mishnah says, I don't get the Rambam. The Rambam is contradicting himself. I don't understand how he can hold both of these halachas. You are allowed to sublease a house. You're not allowed to sublease a field. What's the difference? And he doesn't have an answer. So let's see. This is a good mystery. Uvidrisha simin shimtes zayin sifkat and aleph kasav l'tareitz v'zel shama. So the Drisha, which is a commentary on a work called the Tur, right? He suggests the following answer. He says, Ulanias daiti diyesh chiluk bein bayis l'sada. He says, I think the following is the distinction between a house and a field. The bayis afshi cholam lekalkel bol kmo b'sada v'yoser. He says, even though a house is subject to destruction, or wear and tear, Bikol makom yochol hamasker litein habayis liyad hasocher b'mushlam b'tsuraso u'b'tavniso u'lahasnos imo shiachzirehu liyado kemo shehu. However, there's a tacit condition that the owner makes with the lessee, which is, here is the house. It's got 4 walls. It's got a roof. It's got doors. It's got windows. You must return it back in the condition that I gave it to you. Umalo im yadur bohu o acher. And therefore, the attitude of the landlord is that he doesn't care whether it's this guy who's the tenant or some other guy who's the tenant. What difference does it make to him? As long as he gets back the house in the condition that he released it. But when you rent a field, an agricultural piece of property, we were just talking about this, Izzy, before we started Shir, you have a little a vegetable patch. Now, if you were to let that vegetable patch lay fallow for a season, what would you have to do to the soil afterwards? You'd have to repurpose it. You'd have to recondition the soil. You'd have to probably aerate the soil, plow it up, add fertilizer, There's a lot you'd have to do to the soil. Or let's say someone were to take a cornfield and to plant flaxseed. Flax is a plant that very seriously depletes the nutrients of the soil, apparently. Or let's say it's a field that normally grows barley, and the guy decides to grow wheat on it instead. And that also affects the quality of the soil. Don't ask me, I'm not a farmer. And the owner will not be able to detect that something has affected the soil until sometime later. L'chein shapir yesh ledakdek bo v'lomar lach ani mamin or v'lomar lecha ani mamin v'lo la'acher ad kan l'sham. And therefore, the drishas of the opinion that a landlord does have a right to say, look, I trust you that you're going to use it responsibly for the purpose that we discussed, but you cannot go ahead and lease it to somebody else, because that could end up adversely affecting the quality of the soil at some point later. So that's the distinction that the Drisha makes to argue why the Rambam is permissive to sublet a house, but he's not permissive to sublet a field. Okay, uchein ze kasav nami bisma simin shinta zayin sifkat and alav zelushona. He says the same thing is written by the Sma, who's a commentary to the Shulchan Aruch. He says, "V'lo amru de'ena socher rashai lahaskir kim b'metaltalim shema yavrichem shomer hasheni v'yovedeim." He says the only time that we say that you cannot sublet is with chattel, because we're worried that the second guy is going to take off with it and lose it, and it'll be lost, the chattel. The gam besada mishum shema yakchishem, and the same thing with an agricultural piece of property. We're worried that the sublessee will end up weakening the soil by mistreating it and not using it for its intended purpose. Masha inkein b'maskir beso diachol haros local prati inyane beso v'yasne imo shiachzerenu kein b'shleimuso ad kan l'shona. But when it comes to a house, a structure that is firmly attached to the ground, so the owner shows the house, says this is its condition, and this is what I expect to receive back when you're done with your tenancy. There's only so much damage that can be done to a house, and it can be clearly identified, and the lessee will have to compensate for any damage to a window or a door, etc., etc. So that's the initial answer. He says, "Ulam la'aniyas daiti dvarav shel hasmahim temuhim ve'ina muvanim." He says, "But I don't get it," says Rav Stern. Daha kimo b'metaltalin af shahasocher o hashoel kibel alav achrayas kidinu legabe haba'olim b've'im yovdu yitva osam mimenu. He says, when it comes to chattel, whoever is the first lessee on the piece of chattel, a car, an animal, whatever it is, a piece of furniture, he accepts upon himself all liability. And if any damage or loss occurs to the object, he will have to pay for it, assuming that it wasn't an onus, let's say, okay? But nonetheless, even though the lessee assumes liability for theft or loss, the owner still has a right to say, I do not grant you permission to sublet my car to somebody else, okay? Because I don't want to take risks. With you, I'm willing to take a risk that there'll be damage or loss. With someone else, I'm not. But the guy can, and so what if the guy says, wait a minute, you're not taking any risk. I'm assuming all liability, so I can do with it whatever I want. The halacha says, no, you can't. An owner of a vehicle or some other chattel has a right to say, I don't want risks being taken with my property, even when the other person is assuming full liability. The hagamdim yovdu o yigonvu yuchal litva azos meharishon Mikol makom zuchuto li'itnaged limsor pikdono la'acherim she'eino ne'eman be'einav. That's exactly what he writes. He says, even when the lessee is assuming full liability, nonetheless, the owner still reserves the right to say, I don't want certain people to get their hands on my property. V'im kein lefi zeh, gam beveito shehu muskar u'mushal la'acher, yuchal lomar she'ein retzono she'imaser la'acherim. So why doesn't a landlord have the right to say the same thing? I only want you to occupy my house, my property. I don't want someone else to occupy my property. Okay, that's the mystery. We're going to answer this question. This is a cliffhanger.
Yeah,
So
I was afraid that was going to happen. Got a whole weekend in between. I will still be patient.
Try and get some rest if you can, and we'll resume the Mirza Hashem on Monday. Have a great Shabbos.
Don't rent your house off for the weekend.
And a good Chodesh. Tonight is tonight.
Shkoyach, Rabbi. Be well, everyone. Good Shabbos.
What's that? We're at the end of the packet. Yeah. Okay, great.